Good afternoon. And hi, James, since you're the only one at this point here. This is the second part of cryptography and access management. I had a couple weeks ago shot the first video for that, and I think I got pretty much through all the cryptography stuff and began to talk about the access control stuff. This has been a busy day. This is my third in a row. I'm running just a couple minutes late, so I apologize for that. Give me just a second to make sure I'm on the right pages of notes and everything I need here. It looks like I am. Okay, cool. So like I said, I think we got through pretty straightforward. We of course, last week was all about cryptography, and I've seen that and the folks in the system are making some progress. I think that's a fun part. There's all these different algorithms and ciphers and things you get to play with. And of course, then building into the more modern and admittedly much more complex public key infrastructure and public key encryption. And so we covered that. And then we just got into access management controls. And as we've said before, access management and cryptography go really well together. They really do, because we use the cryptography functionality to both validate people and to, say, sign, digitally sign documents. Protect, obviously cryptography is important from a protection point of view, and since we're talking about access, that's access to systems, that's access to data, and so we talked about plenty of times before, we got to protect data in all of its states. And so cryptography, particularly when we're talking about having data resting somewhere, backed up or stored on a file, having it be encrypted is very important. And of course, most of the time there's some kind of cryptography going on with logging with your bank. There's encryption going on with that SSL, HTTPS, kind of connection, etc. I believe, just a little bit of a review, but I believe that we talked about the main big things that cryptography, the whole process, access control processes do. We provide identity, right? We identify an individual. We then authorize that individual or authenticate that individual, right? The first step is, hi, I'm the system admin. Okay, then give me your password. Okay, then we're going to authenticate that is the system admin. And then we're going to authorize that user to have the rights they have, whether it shouldn't be everything, but a fair amount for a system admin, or if it's just read only to the sales database for a salesperson. And so those are three of the main concepts of what access control is all about. We're wanting to identify, authenticate, and then authorize based on the results of our rules. And of course, we talked about, some of this is pretty straightforward, so I won't go through it, but different levels, read-only, author, admin, corporate policy, I do remember this. We did spend some time in lesson 5 talking about, which has been covered before, but it's a little deeper here, and just things come back, and as we add more to it. But just as a little bit of a review, we did talk a little bit about things like policies that are important tied to access control, like acceptable use policy, password policies. We talked about other policies that are just important to make sure that in a disaster, you have access control. What is your disaster recovery plan? How are you your business continuity planning? How are you setting these things up so that you can move forward? Just like we talked about in the earliest class, actually, that while there's lots of hackers and they get all the headlines, that's not necessarily the biggest threat many times. Sometimes it's a fire or a riot or an earthquake or a hurricane or whatever. So we have to be prepared, have our disaster recovery plans, have our business contingency planning, and be ready to still deal with access control. We can't just throw everything on an open server. I mean, we could, but that would then, of course, in the process of recovering from that disaster, probably create its own disaster when somebody accidentally deletes something they don't need to, etc. So those were the first things we talked about last week. The first part of it is mainly about the cryptography. I actually think that's a lot of fun, and I hope you did too. And so the last chapters last lessons we're going to talk about tonight, and for this week, are lesson 6 on risk management, which is a very important one, actually. We've talked about risk management high level before. We'll go a little deeper today. We'll talk about different types of access control systems. We will talk about securing data in its various states. And then, of course, coming back all the way toward the end to tying some of this together with, okay, how do we implement some of this? How do we tie it into our policies? And then the last section is on PKI, or public key infrastructure. So that's today's agenda, and I'll try to get through fairly quickly. Risk management. It's been said before in other classes. I'm sure I said it when you took some of the other earlier ones, you folks, the security foundations and other system admin maybe too, that a big part of what we're doing in IT is managing risk. That's our job. We're supposed to manage risk. And now we can do that in a number of ways. We can avoid it, right? We can eliminate that risk. We can offset it. We can mitigate it. There's all these different things we do. And ultimately, all that we do in security, from putting in some kind of control to encrypting data to locking the door to putting a firewall in, those are all things we're trying to do to address the risk that our organization faces. We are trying to minimize that risk, get rid of that risk, mitigate that risk. And so, of course, when you start talking about access controls, then you have the issue of, well, shoot, we're talking access to files, we're talking access to servers, systems, firewalls, routers, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't really put your thinking cap on and apply a very solid risk management approach to that, then you end up having situations like what happened in a lot of small companies that, okay, here's all the files, everybody has access. Okay, well, from a convenience point of view, that's easy, right? But as we've learned, there's all those trade-offs, and we don't want to be so secure that we destroy convenience and disable, and stop the organization from doing its job. But we don't want to just be so convenient that accidentally everything could get wiped out, right? And so some of the things that are talked about when it comes to this lesson is the need to do a risk assessment. And we've already talked about that in the broadest sense of an organizational security policy. We need to look at, what are our risks? Well, we have a facility in an earthquake zone. That's a risk. We have a website. Okay, there's a risk there. Anytime that you have a potential threat, which we know there are hackers that attack websites, we know hurricanes and earthquakes do happen. And so if we have that threat paired with the vulnerability of, yes, we have a website and there's a possible attacker, so we got to be aware of that. Yes, we have a facility in Florida, and we know that there's hurricanes all the time in Florida. So anytime those two come together, anytime we have a conjunction of a threat and a vulnerability, then we have a potential risk. Then the issue is to do a very solid, we talked at the first lesson, I should say, first class, about risk management at a very high level. And we talked about how you could do it in both a qualitative and a quantitative way. And the qualitative is just sort of, we take we define all of our risks and we kind of rank them low, medium, and high. And as I mentioned in that course, as a starting point, that's better than nothing, and is important to at least get that far. But many times what you really want to do is try to do a qualitative analysis, so you can really quantify, how much money is involved if we lose that website for that long, or what happens to us if that facility is offline for 3 weeks because of a hurricane, or on and on and on. Now, admittedly, when you start applying it more tactically to the idea of access control, it may not be as easy to do the quantitative, what if somebody accidentally deletes that file? What is the cost? And I'm not saying don't do it. And if you can, you can, and you should. But this is one of those cases where it becomes a case of maybe sometimes you fall back on the qualitative analysis. But what you're looking at, of course, is you're looking at all these wonderful things you may have. You have data, you have databases, you have proprietary software, you have manuals and documentation, you have sales list and prospect list, you have accounts and billing and personal information. Oh my gosh, we have all this stuff, and the vast majority, if not every bit of it, needs to be protected in some form or fashion, and we're going to have to grant access to it in some form or fashion. And so by using the same strategy we use to sort of high level take a look at what we need to do to protect our whole organization, what do we need to do to protect these files? What types of access controls should we put in place? And just like with the big risk assessment, if there's a huge risk that your website's going to go down, it's going to cost you a lot of money, then you're probably going to prioritize fixing and helping to mitigate and address that risk. If you look at all your different data and all your different systems and all your different files on your network, and if this one goes down, you die, your company's out of business, then okay, then that's one we're going to spend a lot of time on. If this one, and same kind of a deal. And so what you're trying to do is then take a look at the different risks, and we come back to a concept that, once again, lots of them come back, but the 7 domains of IT. Just like we exposed that earlier on in the program to get you thinking about IT, the whole infrastructure broken into different kind of buckets or silos so that it wasn't so overwhelming. How am I going to secure all this? Well, you can take it a step at a time. Well, the same thing applies here. What data do users need? What data do they need to get their job done? So we look at the user domain. What kind of data do they need? Do they need read-only? Do they need write? Do they need a combination of it? How are we going to set this up permission-wise? We're going to have shared folders and everybody get their own shares. But instead of just, now we're asking some really pointed questions just about the user domain. What about our server domain? Our servers, that's some really critical data in many cases, right? That's our databases, our customer list. But still, who needs access to it? Why? How is it backed up? Is it backed up off-site? What are our risks if it's not? What if our risk if it goes away? What if somebody deletes everything? On and on and on. These type of questions and analysis and doing this qualitative risk assessment can then let us come back and look at it and go, all right, well, this and this are our big areas. We better spend our money protecting, because if we lose our proprietary software repository, and we're probably dead. And then over here, if our users can't do their job, can't process orders, can't buy supplies, they can't take credit cards, they can't answer support questions, we're probably dead too. And there might be others in the middle that we also care about, high or low. And there's going to be a number of things where it's just like, whatever. An example might be, and I've seen this before, you have a company that's, say, a tech company, pretty technical, they got a lot of websites, they got chat online, they obviously have very secure network infrastructure facilities around the country. They actually still happen to have a good old FTP server up on their network. Now, FTP is an older, unsecure protocol, but it's still in use for many reasons, and one of the big reasons is just as a Dropbox. If I have so this company, for example, is a software company. They provide different they sell products, and they have software updates, is what I meant. And so so they have basically, even though you go to their website, you click on support, you work your way down to your model, and you say, I want the latest drivers, and you get it. But if you were paying attention, you noticed that it's switched, and it's actually pulling an FTP. It's gone to an old FTP site. And I'm sure they've done some level of minimal control, but I'm sure that's not a high priority on their life either, because it just holds publicly available to any member, of all these drivers and old drivers and the drivers they just put out, the drivers they put out for versions 10 years ago. They have just maintained this box. But I'm sure that while they don't want it to be taken over, and they sure wouldn't want somebody to get in and be able to change the data, the integrity, basically patches then become vulnerable and have malware. But beyond that, they've done very little. It's an FTP server, and it's pretty much wide open, and they've locked it down so that only, from the inside, like on a whitelisted IP, that's the only IP that can change any content on that server. Otherwise, have at it. Download it all for all we care. Most people don't. They just want the driver they need. But they've used that, and they've ranked it much lower. So you have to go through and look at your systems and the data they're involved with, and you can then set up various access controls to protect that data. Now, there are a lot of different access control systems as we move into lesson 7. And one thing that you're going to hear again and again and again is ACL. ACL, set up ACLs, file ACLs, different types of ACLs. What are ACLs? Access control list. That's all an ACL is. Now, they take different forms, and they run in different types of situations. You have all different types of variants of them. There is the system access control list. There is a discretionary access control list. There are mandatory access control list, and on and on and on. I'm not getting, they're all in the chapter, so I'll let you read those. But the idea is that you're setting up access controls, and these are different models of how to give information and give permissions. Excuse me. And then arguably mentioned briefly in that lesson as well is something that's becoming more and more popular, has advantages, it does have some disadvantages too, but that's called single sign-on. A lot of times, either in, say, a Windows environment, you might log into an Active Directory, and once you log in and thus identify yourself and authenticate yourself, your authorization then is system-wide. You're sort of given a digital token. Yes, the system is validated. This is Lee, and he or she has access to all of these different information. And then of course, we're seeing this happen in the cloud as well. We're also seeing it happen manually, where it's not so much single sign-on. Maybe that single sign-on is being used, or a simpler sign-on and access control is being used for sort of average users. But then you get down to more elaborate things like routers and firewalls and things, and we may fall back to more traditional access control lists. Only these people, only these machines, only these authorized keys. Only these IP addresses, and a bunch of these come together so that you have a fairly secure way of limiting somebody being able to get into that system. So there are all kinds of different access control methods. I am not going to go through all of them. I will mention Charybdis and Charybdis. Sorry, Radius servers, other types of things like that. These are systems that are used as part of access control. VPN is an access control for that matter. I mean, you're allowing virtual private networking. If you're not talking about a point-to-point between two offices, but you're talking about remote users being in, then you obviously are using access control functionality to let them in. You're authenticating them, authorizing them, or identifying them, authenticating them, and then authorizing them into the network. Now, it's a little bit of a repeat, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but I will talk about a few things that are important in this area, and that's Lesson 8. Lesson 8 is all about protecting data in all its states. Now, we've talked about that all the way back to the beginning, that it's our job in IT to protect technological information, technology assets, and data in all the states. And those states include while it's in use, so it's processing away in somebody's computer, in the RAM on that machine or on that device. It can be in transit, of course. It can be between the client and the server. It can be being transmitted like a credit card off to the bank for validation. And of course, the data can be stored or at rest. You have to be able to protect data in all those forms, and you want to provide different levels of access control depending upon the situation. Data at rest, for example, doesn't make a lot of sense to have all your secure data at rest and encrypted and writable by anybody. So somebody accidentally, even though it's all encrypted, they deleted it all. Ooh, that would be bad, right? So once again, we're going to try to think through what we need to do here. When it comes to data in motion, when data in motion is we're transmitting it, however you want to use that motion of transmit, it's actually in some ways, depending on if you do it right, but kind of one of the easier things to deal with. We have SSL, we have SSH, we have all kinds of encryption mechanisms. And so it's sort of like when we connect and we're logging into a secure site or doing our Amazon purchases or whatever the case is, we have protocols we can use. When it comes to around our network, we can do the same thing. You'll see this in some other classes. I think we talked about it actually briefly in system admin. That choice of protocol is very important. Normally, we are going to take SSH over Telnet every day of the week. Now, we happen to use Telnet when we work with GSN3, but we're working local to a simulated. You do sometimes still see it. I think one of the most recent times I saw it, surprisingly a little bit, but there was a Telnet interface, a command line interface to this fancy schmancy office printer. I did not expect that, but when I ran a port scan on the network from a client, that was like, why are you running a Telnet server? And it turned out to be a serial interface so that device could be administered. We ended up turning it off, and so we didn't want it to be a risk. And I guess until the repair guys came and needed it, it didn't need to be on. But nonetheless, you have all of these different things to do with. So if you're letting that remote worker in, we're going to use virtual private networking and encrypt that traffic. If we're doing something on the web, we're going to use HTTPS so we can encrypt that traffic. We're going to use secure copy protocol, secure SSH, secure FTP instead of FTP. And so we're going to use protocols. So generally speaking, that the data in motion is actually fairly easy, to protect, because there are protocols in place. We can encrypt it from end to end. We can encrypt it from us to the bank. We can encrypt that response code. We can encrypt our credit card to Amazon and vice versa, and that works pretty well. When we deal with data in use, that's where it gets a little more complex, because of the fact that the data, let's just take some proprietary database, but the client, it's one of your employees is now here working away, working on some kind of database entry, updating somebody's balances or whatever. The data is on the server. There's a database, and then of course that huge database, so there's no way, we haven't pulled the whole thing over here, so not all of it's here, but a certain amount of it's here, maybe even additional records above and below the one that person's on. Is the machine anticipates you're going to go to the next record, depending on what kind of software we're talking about, how it was indexed. But nonetheless, there may be a chunk of this proprietary database that's now right here in the RAM of this computer. And if there is some way, which there are technically many ways, you could capture, dump, and get all the data out of it. It wouldn't even have to be that user. And most likely probably wouldn't be that user. Maybe there was a virus or something on that machine that is capturing that memory, looking for key things, looking for certain patterns like social security numbers or credit card numbers or whatever. So here's just somebody working in your office. They've pulled the data over to their machine. They're updating an entry. They click save. It goes back. The transmission was encrypted. That was good. We covered the motion. Over here, it's locked down, encrypted, and backed up, and offsite replicated on the data side. So we got it rusted. We got it secured pretty good. But here in use, somehow somebody grabbed a piece of it, or somehow something got a hold of it, whether that was a malicious user or a smart user or a Trojan or virus or whatever the case is. So be aware. Now, there are ways to deal with that. We can sandbox things. Sometimes people will, that's why you sometimes see organizations that they're running a PC. It's a brand new PC, as fancy as can be, but they're running this little emulator, and that's how they're doing their point of sales. Fry's is a good example. They got these nice PCs. They sell computers out the wazoo, but you look at what they're doing. They're running this kind of old school software, and that's because they're really running it there. It all runs on the server. They're just using sort of terminal emulation to see that information. And so that sort of mini computer model of the past with dumb terminals, well, it takes away the risk that the terminal can be the threat. So keep in mind that the hardest one is protecting data in use. Data in motion, you can use the protocols, and then of course data in rest you can use encryption and various other means. Now there is one thing to just make a little point about, is that you can use your firewall to protect yourself in some of these cases too. Whether it be things like, there's known backdoors to command and control botnets out there. Well, we want to block those. We don't want an infected machine to be able to get out. And so sometimes, setting up both, it's one of the things people sometimes forget. We're always worried about what's coming in. We build our imaginary line, we build our firewalls, we get everything filtering and watching it come in, and we sometimes forget about what's going out. And so somehow Bill in accounting got a virus. He brought home, something from home on a USB stick he's working on the weekend, but his kid had played with that and taken it to his friend's house, gotten the virus, and now there's this virus in the network. And one of the things that many of them are going to do is try to call home. So if we can at least be able to monitor that on the way out and alert on it or block it at the firewall level, and then that's one way also to protect that data in use and transit and keep it from going someplace we don't want it to go. We're doing good here. Now, chapter 9, or lesson 9, is a very important one. It starts to bring some of this together. It's sort of like I taught the second part of Security Foundations earlier today in my back-to-back lectures. And if you remember that class, we start off with terminology and some basics, and then at the end we kind of come together with this whole organizational security idea that, okay, we're going to do all these things we've learned. We're going to protect against these hackers. We're going to design these policies, put these controls in place, et cetera. And that's what the end goal is. Well, in this case, we're looking at a little bit of that same thing. For this one, the end goal is not just to throw access rules in place for access rules purposes. It's not just to make it hard so everybody can get, oh, you want to get to the data? Well, that's going to take a triplicate form, and you're going to have, no. We're just like everything else. Those balances of trade-off versus security. We're trying to find that good spot, that sweet spot, where we're able to let people get in. Remember, limiting. We're going to let them get into the data they need, but only what they need, and then we're going to control it on the other side. And so, access control lists and access control policy, very critical to do right to make sure that this happens. So, a number of things that will happen here is that you're going to end up using, it's kind of almost an iterative thing, actually, to be honest, but if you have your organizational policy, we ensure to be the best company that does this and secure, and we value customer data, blah, 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 and that leads down to our privacy policy and our acceptable use policy, and that leads down further down to procedures of how to set up this machine, how to set up this router, and how to use our password policy, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we need to make sure that in that we're discussing our access controls. If you think about it from like a Department of Defense standard, the former place I taught, that was one of the assignments students had to do, was they had to pretend they all of a sudden were the company that just got a defense contract, and their world changed greatly. And they even were assumed to have a halfway decent security, and now they got to meet DoD standards. So, but you think about DoD standards, DoD, secret, top secret, clearance, all these different levels. Well, that's important. That data classification is important, and many organizations go through something similar, at least informally, even though it's probably better to do it formally, and then to incorporate that into this whole organizational framework and within the structure, so that we have statements and policies that talk about top secret data is this, and only this many people, and this is all documented. It all flows, and that way, then when somebody shows up, you buy a new company next month, and they have, all you have to do then is go look at their data and go, okay, well, that's top secret, that's standard, that's on the web, whatever, and then you can reclassify it, and you can apply your policies and what you've done. Now, you might have to update for other things. They've got new equipment, or it's time to junk theirs and buy some new so it matches yours. But regardless, the idea being that these access controls are very, very important in helping us control access to systems, access to data. And it's kind of where the rubber meets the road. It's that's why it's a separate class even. It's very important to make sure we do these things right and we think them through, and we use all the things we've been learning along the way. We want to think about layer. We want to think about security and defense. We want to think about all the other things we've learned about. We want to think about and look at the different examples. What are the best practices of 2 or 3 of the different frameworks? Don't just think okay, well, nobody needs to get access to that data, or they only you may think but you can go do surveys. You can ask your employees. You can take an assessment look. We talked about one of the things about an access control and information assessment that's a little different than, say, it's like that whole overall corporate assessment is, you go to data owners and be like, if your data was gone for 6 months, what would happen to the company? You may or may not. I mean, if it was the sales database, that you probably could make a guess that would be bad. But what if it was XYZ database? It's just a prospect database, or it's some ideas that they've been building over here in this SharePoint, all these possible future marketing campaigns. And they're just different data stores, different information. You're trying to decide how to protect it, how to control it, who needs access to it. And one of the ways you do that with the risk assessment is ask them questions. So hypothetically, if that went away, what impact would it have? Well, we probably wouldn't be able to roll out any new ad campaigns, or we wouldn't be able to roll as fast because we go there to pull our ideas, and we got a lot of half-written content and just things we've thrown up there, but we'd have to start from scratch. So it'd probably slow us down, but would that be enough to kill the company? Maybe, maybe not. You go ask somebody else over there, with this database, you've spun up this container, you've got all this terabytes of data in this S3 bucket up in the cloud. What happens if it goes away? Oh my God, it's an entire source code repository backup. That would be bad. And so we can then use that kind of assessment to then dictate, help dictate the access control policies. There is a lot more in Chapter 9 talking about You know, some of the other standard bodies and how that affects. Once again, like it's always good to go look at what they're doing. They'll have guidelines or best practice documents, etc. And so then I think that leaves me with mainly talking about, and since nobody's here to ask questions, we'll just do it. The last thing to talk about, moving a little faster than I thought, but that's okay. I guess I'm catching up from the first 2 classes today, is lesson 10, public key, PKI, public key infrastructure and encryption. At the highest level, I shouldn't have to explain it now, technically, because you've worked through the first so many lessons and you've already gotten some examples. You've looked at Caesar ciphers and all these ciphers as you work your way through. Excuse me once again. And then you were even given the Alice and Bob example to explain at least the high levels of public key encryption. And you're going to get another little bit of a visit with good old Alice and Bob. And there's some talk in there about, of course, some of the standards, X509 certifications, et cetera, et cetera. But let me just talk you through it high level so we make sure we cover it and everybody understands it. Public key infrastructure, in the broadest sense, is the whole infrastructure. It's the key servers and certificate servers and all that. And we have it in the broad internet. I mean, when you go to Amazon now and you connect to Amazon and Amazon turns the little lock sign on and it says it's all, or your browser does, it says it's all secure. That is because in the background, this has happened. Your browser has talked to Amazon. Amazon has claimed to be Amazon by sending back a certificate. Your browser, unbeknownst to you, then looks at that and first just does a high level. You may have seen the error if the dates are a little off on the certificates, they haven't been renewed, or maybe the name on a certificate is slightly different than the URL being used. Those kind of things will throw Firefox or IE or whatever to go, are you sure you trust this? But assuming that's not the case, there's no obvious errors, you've talked to Amazon and you've been presented with an Amazon certificate. Well, if that's all there was to it, then it would be easy to scam because we could all just send out, yeah, I'm Amazon or I'm whatever site. But there's another process that goes on. It's all still tied to public key encryption. But we have these certificate servers, these signing authorities out there. So those can be VeriSign, Network Solutions, GoDaddy. Almost everybody sells SSL certificates now. And as such, given the broadening of the registration for a web period, they can all sell web domains, they can all sell all the other stuff. So you can get an SSL certificate. And when you get an SSL certificate, then you're actually going through a process of validation and digital encryption key signing to validate that entity. And so what Amazon had to do to make that work is they had to go to their provider and say, hey, we're Amazon. We really need this to be a log sign, to be green. We want the best one you got. And we want to validate that, so when anybody comes, they instantly know it's us. And so what happens is Amazon on the server that they're, or server, they create a key. They create a key pair, a public and a private key pair. And then they, of course, submit part of that along with their request for the certificate to, say, VeriSign, Network Solutions, VeriSign, GoDaddy, it doesn't matter who. That entity, of course, has also generated a key pair, a public and private key pair, and then they use that to sign. Of course, and depending on the level you're at the lowest level of SSL certificates, there's not much more that happens than automatically, oh yeah, there's a domain there, okay. But as you get higher level ones, those really nice ones that turn the bar green and make everybody happy, those cost more money, and you'll literally have potentially, depending upon the provider and who they're validating. But I helped a nonprofit once, a 100-year-old nonprofit. They've been around forever, had a website forever. And when we went to do an e-commerce for them to sell some, branded merchandise, we got an SSL certificate so the credit cards and everything would be secure. And sure enough, I did all that like I'm talking about on my server. I generated the keys. I filled out the request. I sent them the public key. They shared me their key. We signed and we agreed with each other. They give me then this digital certificate, that SSL key, to put on my server and assign it to that IP and that website. But they got a call at the actual office. Okay, we would like, and they had made them, I think, send in, certain documentation to prove that they were really that person. So those signing entities will do that, and that way, in that nanoseconds behind the scenes, you go to Amazon. Amazon says, "I'm Amazon." Your browser says, "Hey, VeriSign, is this really Amazon?" And because of the encryption signatures, there's no way that that person can fake that. I mean, I shouldn't say there's no way, but in the average course of events, not counting fake signatures or something like that, generally speaking, it's exactly what you think. It's your bank. It's Amazon, and because there's a multi-thing. So that's how the web works for SSL and secure transactions and things like that. And this is really, it's if you get that, then it's really easy to understand how the corporate world works, because they just do the same thing, except that they're just doing the keys themselves. So you might have, and it's not uncommon, it has its advantages and disadvantages, but you saw in the Network Foundations class that you can actually set up, the ability to log into a box SSH secure without even having to log in. You just have to have the approved key. And a lot of different corporate environments will use key management in their own digital servers and their own certificate servers. And then they will have a whole lifecycle process. They will generate a key, assign it to somebody for a period of time, and then if it needs to be renewed or revoked or et cetera. And these keys, this whole thing, that's what allows, instead of logging in per se, I have a key, I have a digital key. And now as the admin, when I try to get into that box, I can log into it because my key is approved there, or I have to get a new key. And so instead of having, there's advantages and disadvantages about something. Don't give me, given sort of the way I work, I think if you use really, really good passwords, then that's a good way to go. But I know that can be a big pain of password management, and then you're dealing with users. So the idea of being able to manage keys and authentication and access control and all that through automatic things and key management has appeal. But at the end of the day, it just seems like something else you got to manage, and you got to revoke them. And if you don't take that certificate away, and Sarah leaves and it's disgruntled, and now she can still get in through the VPN because her key's still active. I mean, 601 after is another. You've got to complete the loop from a security point of view and close out a member, whether that's disable their account or disable their key or disable their password or whatever the case is. But there are a number of things you can do, and so there are the certificate authorities, registration authorities, there's certificate servers, there's repos. Most of the time you see this in this day and age, for the most part, is in a couple different areas. One is occasionally complete and total just geeks. I used to be, when I was a kid, did some of this, just chatted with a few of my friends with public key encryption. Every time we chat, we weren't chatting about anything except what we were going to do that Friday, what movie we were going to see, but every message we sent was encrypted. It became more trouble than it's worth after a while, but we did it for fun. There are people who have legitimate needs for that. They live in oppressive states. They are activists trying to help in those areas, or help people that are, investigative journalists, reporters, investigating law enforcement, investigating, crime, being things like that. So having encryption, and of course, encryption is becoming more and more important. Google is now making it so that to have the HTTPS actually helps rank higher, and if you don't, then they may warn against your site. There's things like that. And then, of course, we're just seeing that more and more people are thinking that everything should be encrypted. Given all the breaches and the scandals and the data scaring, things like that, then there is an argument to say, okay, we should, every bit of data going from every browser to every server and every email and everything should be encrypted, that nobody can spy, nobody can listen in. And the sort of egalitarian, libertarian, very open kind of guy on one hand says, yeah, that makes sense. But then there's a practical part of me that says that's actually a bunch of bunk. It's one of my, and this is just my opinion, I'm a little bit on a soapbox, but like I said, Google's making it to where that HTTPS, the secure protocol of the web, is its preferred method. It wants every website ultimately HTTPS. This is great for them to be able to say, well, Nobody can. Now everybody's protected. Nobody can read your information, and it even provides them some liability protection because they're not eligible. You know, they don't know what went through, even if you're routing through them or using their own servers for search or whatever. It's all encrypted. And I get the privacy. I'm a very private person. I don't want anybody reading my stuff. But if I am a web designer and I'm building a website for a restaurant, and the restaurant's got a menu on it, why does the menu have to be encrypted? I mean, I guess somebody could argue, well, now somebody knows you were thinking about, or maybe you went and booked a reservation and you went to that, so they're tracking you. But like I said, I think it may be a little overkill. We'll see if this continues and that's just the way it goes for the future, or if other mechanisms will come into place. But from our point of view, it's important to know what public key infrastructure is, and the some of the pieces, and just to understand public key encryption. It's very important. As a matter of fact, without public key encryption, none of what we do now, period, would work when it comes to the web, when it comes to secure commerce, particularly. Because, you know, that if you think back to those first few lessons, there was some really neat, and there's lots of others. Maybe you've done some additional research on it. I used to be a big fan of puzzles and keys and ciphers. And so I think that first part of this class is just fascinating to review those and go back. But of course, the key had to be transferred. We had to get together. If I wanted to communicate with you, I had to somehow share you that key. And of course, if it could be captured or whatever. And so the whole public-private key encryption, where a key pair is generated, the public keys are exchanged, but then across, compile a public to private forces a nice encrypted message that only the recipient can unknow. And it can be done without ever having to meet. That's why I can go to Amazon and start buying something, because that key exchange will happen and the servers out there will validate it. And of course, if I don't trust it, or that doesn't, lock doesn't happen, or Google pops up some message about this site's out of date, then at least I have a warning about that kind of stuff. So very important. I will mention one last thing about key stuff, because we're running out of time here. It actually applies to lots of things. When you are dealing with, I think you've already seen it, you've seen it in network foundations, but when you're dealing with SSH and some of these others, you're actually doing kind of a similar thing. You have a public or private key. When we did that whole exercise where we authorized a user to only sign in via the approved authorized keys file in the .ssh folder, you were, of course, putting the public one up there that matched your private one, so that when you tried to log in, that could happen and you would be authenticated and allowed access. SSH and those types of protocols use a public, a key combination too. One thing to note about that key combination, and the way it's similar to what happens when Google says, hey, this certificate's out of date, is, let's just say you run a server, you run a VYOS router, you run a Linux server, it's in the cloud someday, and you connect to it ever so often with SSH, and you are very happy to connect in and do your work. And then one day you connect in and it says, do you trust this key? Well, the very first time well, I've seen this in those earlier classes, but the very first time you connect to any public key, private key kind of situation like that, SSH, etc., these keys exchange, and then you'll be asked if you trust that entity. And so, of course, if I've just obviously set up a brand new server, when I did, I installed SSH, it generated its first key pair, I can look at that file, and then when I try to log in remotely, I say, yes, I trust that key. And then you should never see that message again. Because if you do, there's really only two things that can be happening. One is some admin on your team has upgraded SSH and regenerated keys, which now means nobody's going to be able to get in, or everybody's going to get that message. Or worse yet, somebody's hacked your SSH. And they have overridden it. They've caused it to generate new keys so they can get in. And of course, I literally have seen this years and years ago, but I saw this was a SSH hack in the earlier days of OpenSSH. Pre-1, I think, 1 dot something, whatever, very long time ago. But nonetheless, on a server that I was dealing with, I go to log in, been working with the server in this environment for this company for quite some time, and it pops up, do you trust this key? And I'm like, no, I didn't change anything. So I close everything out, cancel, control alt delete, kill it, go run around the office talking to all the other techs and security people. What the heck? Did anybody mess with that server? Did it get re-imaged today? What happened? I'm being asked. Somebody else tries. They're getting asked the same question. Oh, crap. We've got a problem here. And long story short, it turned out that somebody had been able to use an exploit that had not been known at the time on the OpenSSH daemon, the server, and they had basically been able to basically reinitialize it, but with their control. And it also, in the process, turned it into a Trojan, a backdoor. So not that they needed it. Once they had that, they had access. But what it was going to do was key. I guess it really is maybe not Trojan, but keylogger. It was going to log everybody's commands. And so, yeah, keep in mind that if keys change for unexpected reasons, then those are definitely security incidences you need to look into. Anyway, as we reach the end of this one here, let me just double check my notes. This is I think that's a pretty good cover of the high level of this one. This one, as you've probably already seen now, we started off with a concept class. We got more hands-on. We kind of split the difference. These classes in this section now are sort of flipping it. They're more hands-on, but this one's probably the highest concept one. A lot of exercises that are more less hands-on and more research or answering questions, etc. You will be finishing up this one. When you finish up, you'll be heading into logging and monitoring, much more like network defense. You'll be learning all about logs and some of the other related tools. So if you have any questions between now and the end of the week, of course, hit me on Slack, drop me an email. Joy and I are happy to help. We have a lot of students as it continues to grow. And I'm expecting some progressions next week into new classes and then another new start as well. So I guess maybe next week I'll be doing, instead of 3 a day, 4 a day. It just keeps going apparently. But anyway, let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a good day. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.